Keeping Morale, a look at Nehemiah, the Great Motivator. Hello, everyone. My name is Persohn. You can contact me at pastor@mascot.church or in the comments below. If you wish, I'd like to thank you for coming back and visiting with me this weekend. If you like these videos, like, share, subscribe. You know how it goes. We don't monetize the videos, but when you do that sort of stuff, YouTube might recommend it on to somebody else. It might bless someone else. Send them to your friends, to your enemies, whatever. Nehemiah. Well, we know the name, and some of us have a general idea of who he is, and we're going to touch on him a little bit today because there's a couple of practical things we want to look at today. Going forward, though, this video will sit more than likely in a playlist about the post-exilic writers, or the post-exilic books. Well, what are they? They're the books that were compiled or that are specifically about the events after Israel returns from the exile and before that dark period of 400 years after the prophet Malachi, before the angel comes and visits the mother of John the Baptist, and then John is born and the Lord Jesus Christ is born. And so this is a very, very important group of books. I'll just pop up on the screen the personalities here that are probably most important in this area. They are Zechariah the prophet, Haggai, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. These are all very important people in this post-exilic sort of set of books of writings. Nehemiah is the gentleman we're going to look at today, just very briefly. Now, we're certainly not going to do this in detail. The story is so involved, and there's so much about this that in a 20-minute session, you can barely do anything. But let's just tell the story. Let's get a sense for this man, Nehemiah, and then also we'll also then be able to see his the other man, Ezra, who worked with him later on. They're really important in getting this right. Now, it's likely that Ezra was the scribe or the writer who compiled 1st Chronicles and 2nd Chronicles, as well as the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which used to be one book, which are actually structured very similarly. It's really fascinating. My sense of I had to really trap myself and stop myself from getting caught in rabbit holes when I was getting ready for this message. But nevertheless, look, there's just a lot in here, okay? So we're looking at Nehemiah today. Now, Israel went into exile. I won't do dates today, but we will in the future. We've done it many times. But they went into exile, the final exile into Babylon after the Assyrian captivity in the north. The southern nation went in under Nebuchadnezzar. There were 3 deportations, and they started from the highest level of society, then the middle level, and then the lower level, leaving just a handful of people in Jerusalem. The temple was burned. This is under Nebuchadnezzar. And really, the first deportation, the purpose was to stop rebellion, to keep the people calm. We're taking away the leaders, so basically you're under our control, but this is Babylon, and so on. But that didn't work. Then they had the second exile, and finally the third. And so that's how the first exile of the southern nations took place. Okay, the northern nations had been exiled under the Assyrians. Assyria fell to Babylon. Years later, the southern nation fell into judgment, was exiled into Babylon. So 3 deportations out of the nation. There were also at least 3 returns. It's possible there were 4 returns from exile back into the country. You had the first one under Zerubbabel, who probably should have been on the list I just showed you, very important, but in the and he probably should have been there. And then the second under Ezra, and the third under Nehemiah. Now, there is a possibility there was another one, someone else in Zerubbabel's time. Maybe we'll deal with that. It's really kind of small detail stuff, but it looks quite possible. So these were groups of people who returned from exile in Persia to the land. I better clarify this. The first exile, when the people went into captivity in Assyria in the north, the 10 northern tribes. Many years later, the southern nation fell, and they went to Babylon. While they were in the nation of Babylon, Babylon fell to the Persians. The great King Cyrus had a slightly different view of foreign policy and wanted to return the captive peoples from all over his kingdom back to their nations. The Jews were included. There were 3 or maybe 4 groups of returns, okay, back to the land. So the first return was under Zerubbabel. The temple was built. Years later, Ezra came, about 80 years later, Ezra came, and he restored worship in the land. Now you say, well, that's a long time. Yes, well, there were many people who were in Babylon, now controlled by the Persians, who wanted to stay. They were making money. They were doing fine. But they'd walked away from their God. Yet the clarion call was out to return to the land. So only a very few did return. And finally, a bit after Ezra and Nehemiah comes, Ezra's job is to build a temple worship and get that whole thing right, the Levites, the altars, and so on, get all of that just functioning the way God wanted to. But Nehemiah, and during this time, Nehemiah is the cupbearer of the king in Persia. And he gets word that things are not doing well at all in his homeland, that the people are downtrodden. Fundamentally, he hears that the city of Jerusalem has no walls. The walls are broken down. So what does that mean, that the city has no walls? Well, the city without walls is easy to conquer. And so there would be raids at night, and there would be constant strife. The people could not live in peace without the walls in the city. So Nehemiah was downtrodden, and the king said, well, what's going on? Why are you downtrodden? Well, how did this relationship work? Well, Nehemiah was the cupbearer, the wine taster for the king. This is a very highly confidential position. He's very close to the king. He's also the one who is the first one to get poisoned if there's poison in the king's wine or the king's food. Let me just check my software here that everything is working fine. Yes, it is. So the king and Nehemiah become close, and Nehemiah is, as we see later on, Nehemiah is a man of exceptional insight and courage. He's an administrator, very gifted. And so Nehemiah is downtrodden, and the king sees it, and the king says to, through some things that are going on here, Nehemiah is given permission to go back to Jerusalem, to be relieved of his duty in the temple, in Persia, and to run or build or create a program to rebuild the walls of the city. Boy, I hope that's clear. There's so much going on in this story, just so much, and it's just fascinating. Once you get into it, you really think, oh my. So the purpose of that this is in the scripture, all of this to set the stage for the coming of Christ and the final conclusion of the eschaton. It's really an important group of books. When you see and understand the books in the way that I'm going to communicate them to you coming up, not week by week, but we'll give it some time, you'll get a good sense of how this feeds into the Lord's ministry, John the Baptist's ministry, and the fact that the time of the end had to have occurred in that time as well. There's a strong eschatological element looking at these books. I have got my work cut out for me. Let's get back to Nehemiah. Nehemiah, when you read his book, is likable. You quite like Nehemiah because of how his book is written, how Ezra recorded it. It's written in the first person. It's, I did this, I did that. You kind of get a feeling for the heart of Nehemiah. In fact, as I've read through Nehemiah a couple of times getting ready for this and listened to some talks and looked at some theology on the whole thing, some commentaries, I began to think that Nehemiah is probably one of those in the scriptures that we get to know best personally because of the way he writes and the way that he talks and the way he communicates. It's really a first-person writing. Now, in order to satisfy your curiosity about that or to illustrate that, I'm going to actually read Nehemiah 6 to you. We'll put it up on the screen, and you can get a sense of this, and then we'll come back and learn some things about Nehemiah as a motivator, because that's where we're going to stop today on this message. We're going to see Nehemiah as a man who was a great administrator, intelligent, set there by God, but who knew how to motivate people and who knew how to be a good example. And in these days where things are rocky and things are rough, we need to have good motivators, and we need to be sure that we're well motivated. We need to keep our morale high. And Nehemiah was a man who was able to do that. So pop into the screen with me. I'll pop into the screen. You can follow. This is Nehemiah chapter 6, and I'm reading in the English Standard Version. And Nehemiah is setting the stage because there are some enemies. He has 3 enemies, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, and they're constantly leading the charge against Nehemiah. They don't want him to rebuild the wall. They don't want him to be there. They want the city to be the way that it was. It could be easily raided. It could be easily taken and used for other purposes. They think they know what's coming. They don't want it to happen, and they begin to make life miserable for Nehemiah, or they try to. They try to. Let's have a read. Now when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left in it, although up to that time I'd not set up the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, let us meet together at Hakkapirim, how do you like that, in the plain of Ono. But they intended to do me harm. And I sent messengers to them, saying, I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? And they sent to me 4 times this way, and I answered them in the same manner. In the same way, Sanballat, for the 5th time, sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, it is reported among the nations that Geshem, and Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building the wall. And according to these reports, you wish to become their king. And you have also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem. There's a king in Judah. That's what the prophets were to proclaim. A slightly wrong emphasis. You've also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there's a king in Judah. And now the king will hear of these reports. So now come and let us take counsel together. Then I sent to him, saying, no such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind. For they all wanted to frighten us, thinking their hands will drop from the work and it will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. See how Nehemiah writes this? Here we go. Verse 9. And they all wanted to frighten us, thinking their hands will drop from the work. It will not be done. But now, O God, strengthen my hands. Verse 10. Now when I went into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Daliah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined to his home, he said, let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night. But I said, should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in. And I understood and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin, so that they could they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month, Elul, in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Ara, and his son Jehanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, as his wife. Also they spoke of his good deeds in my presence, and reported my words to him, and Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid. Nehemiah chapter 6, you notice that Nehemiah talks very much in the first person. He relates this story. So his 3 enemies, Geshem, Sanballat, and Tobiah, who don't want him to be there, try to intimidate Nehemiah. They say, come, let's meet in this place, But Nehemiah knows they probably want to kill or kidnap me. He rejects it. Finally, a 5th, an open letter is sent by Sanballat, and the open letter says, that's not to him, right? So that's to everybody. It's, we intend to make Nehemiah king, or I intend to make myself king. Sanballat says, you've also set up false prophets in the city to proclaim you as a king. And it's intimidation. He's working on Nehemiah's integrity here. And now this is interesting here, because there had been a false attempt to rebuild the walls earlier in the reign of that Persian king. So there's a little bit figures into this. Maybe Sanballat is thinking the Persian support for this return, maybe he could erode it. What does Nehemiah say? He said, sorry, I am not listening to you. He said that you're making this up. I'm not doing it. And what does he do? He stays on the job. This is so interesting. He does not engage his critics. He just hands them off, stays on the job, and he continues to work. A prophet invites Nehemiah to his home, and the sense of this prophet's invitation is that the prophet is confined to his house. Maybe he's crippled or whatever. They get to the home, and the prophet he's not so crippled after all. And he says to Nehemiah, let's go to the temple, because if you hide in the temple, you'll be protected from those who want to kill you. And Nehemiah is not a priest. He's an administrator. He's not a prophet. Only priests were allowed in the temple anyways. He said, no, such a man as I could never do that. He said, besides, I'm not the kind of person to run away. I'm not doing it. Then he realized that this prophet had been hired by his enemies, Sanballat and Tobiah. So you see this very fascinating man full of insight. You also read that sprinkled through these comments are prayers Nehemiah would pray. Oh, God, help me in this. Nehemiah was a man who would just pray on the spot in the presence of any trouble. Some of his prayers were long, others were short. Lord, just help me with all of this. Even after this time, after the wall was built, Tobiah still produced trouble for Nehemiah, which we'll look into probably in a later conversation. But we're just setting the stage now for the kind of man that Nehemiah is. Immediately when I read the story of Nehemiah, I like him. He's affable. He talks in the first person. You realize that he has gained control over his baser passions. He's emotional for people who've gotten in trouble. He's emotional for the service of God, yet it never stops him from doing his job. You find that this man was able to very strongly motivate a ragtag group of builders who would have probably had it better off had they stayed in Babylon. The enemies, I got a couple of notes down here from earlier on in the book. They, let me see. So Sanballat and Tobiah come and, yes, the problem here is there's so much in the story, and I don't want to get too distracted. In chapter 4 of Nehemiah, as the wall is being built, Sanballat makes a very famous statement. He said, if a fox climbs up on the wall, it's going to crumble. Well, we learn later on that the wall is built actually pretty well because two choirs operate on the wall, one led by Ezra, another by Nehemiah. They go opposite directions across the distance of the wall, so it's not so bad. You'll note that what the enemies of Nehemiah wanted to do was cause fear and intimidation. Chapter 4 and verse 7, this is earlier, a bit before the bit I just read to you. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites, the Ashdodites, heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very angry. So I've got angry enemies outside. And they all plotted together and to come and fight against Jerusalem to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. This is Nehemiah the builder. This is Nehemiah the motivator. You're causing this. Our enemies are causing this struggle. Some are internal, some are external. We're committing it to God. We're continuing on the job. We put a watch up. We're doing it. You can see in Nehemiah, not only is a good leader and a good motivator, he's absolutely committed to the task. Let me read verse 10 of Nehemiah 4. In Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There's too much rubble. By ourselves we'll not be able to rebuild the wall. So imagine, Nehemiah turns up and there's just rubble everywhere. The Babylonians have flattened the city and there's just junk and there's rubble everywhere. You see these distraught ragtag group of builders saying, we're never going to be able to do that. And not only did the men say it, not only did the workers say it, our enemies said they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. So not only did they have to do the work, but their lives were being threatened by their enemies. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us, you must return to us. No, just come back out and live in the country. You don't need to do this job. So they have internal trouble and external trouble. Verse 13 of 4. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall in the open places, I stationed people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. You can hear this man motivate his workers. Notice he put them together by their clans. This is really wise. He didn't grab people disparately and force them together. He kept family groups together to protect areas of the wall and to do the jobs together. Why? You work well with those you know. Well, not always do you work well with family, but you get the sense. These clans, these tribes, they have the same dialects, they come from the same background, the same aspirations, and so on. And this is Nehemiah says, don't be afraid of them. Just don't. Our God is going to look after us. And Nehemiah had to get to the place where he had to arm his workers, down to verse 21 of Nehemiah 4. So we labored at the work, and half of them held spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I'm thinking of Gideon here too. I also said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So imagine the exhaustion, guarding and working, guarding and working. So neither I or my brothers or my servants nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. So they worked, went to bed in their construction clothes, right? Just were ready to fight at any time. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. Imagine the level of motivation necessary to keep these worn-out builders who weren't soldiers to hold on to their weapons, keep them ready, because you're going to have to fight at any time. It takes a great motivator to do that. It takes somebody who really knows how to build courage in an audience, in his people to do that. someone who does not allow his people to become demoralized. And you can see this. Now, there were also problems that took place in between them. In Nehemiah chapter 5, you find out that people were charging interest to one another, which was against the law of God. Nehemiah had to fix that. It's like, whoa, man, this guy is not only is he motivating his people, he's helping them to behave together. He's keeping them on the job all the time. Nehemiah 5, worth looking at. Let me have a look at my time. Oh, dear Lord. Oh, I've got to go a few minutes longer here. And down in verse, I like to stay in 20 minutes. Can't do it this time. The topic is so good. In Nehemiah 6, which we just had a look at, Sanballat and Tobiah start tormenting Nehemiah, and they say, come down and meet with us. Come down and meet with us. And he said, no. He said, I'm doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? So this is after 4 attempts to get to him, to meet with him. This was after a 5th open letter. Imagine that Nehemiah is not alone. He's not alone there working on the stones. And by the way, he's actually working. He's got his hands dirty. There are men around him who are watching. There are women around who work the job as well. It's interesting, one man brought his daughters to do the work as well. He didn't have, obviously, sons. So there's people watching Nehemiah work, watching him do this, listening to him being tormented, listening to him being tempted. He said, listen, man, I'm doing a great work. I'm not coming down. I'm not doing it. What a great lesson in morale and motivation when your leaders do not flinch at all. Do not flinch at all. So this is this is kind of the sense of this great man, Nehemiah. Okay? Now, Nehemiah and Ezra are contemporaries. Ezra appears to be a little bit older. Ezra's a scribe, a slightly more, how shall I say, I want to say dour, but it's not really, maybe more of a serious man than Nehemiah. It seems that Nehemiah knows how to celebrate. At the time when the walls are built and the job is complete, Nehemiah says, rejoice, feast, have a good time. The joy of the Lord is your strength. He really knows how to celebrate in the victory that's there. Okay, so we've kind of set the stage for someone we want to talk a lot more about. We've kind of set a bit of the stage for a time period we want to talk a lot more about. That's the post-exilic time period. And I can barely keep my breath. I love this topic so much. And we're going to go forward, probably create a playlist, and dig at why this is such an important time in history. So let me see. Do I have any other notes on this screen? I do not. My name is Al Persohn. You can contact me by email or comments or whatever. I hope you enjoyed this. Come back soon. This has been Keeping Morale in Nehemiah, the Great Motivator.